If you thought the right wing was obsessed with gun rights, so-called gun rights, wait till you get a load of the next story where it's way worse than you realized. In order to talk about that, we're going to bring in Ryan Busse. He's a senior advisor at Giffords and an author of Gunfight. And he also used to work in the gun rights movement. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so Ryan, welcome.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
No problem. Before we get to the disastrous turn of events that happened in the Bruin case, which you're going to explain to us, and the absurdities that come out of it. So what happened? Why'd you switch your mind on so-called gun rights?
I don't really think that I did change my mind. I mean, I'm still pro-gun. I own lots of guns and I shoot and hunt with my family, and I was just hunting yesterday. What changed, I think, was the gun culture and culture of irresponsibility and radicalization within the gun industry. It's become very, exceedingly bad in the last 15, 18 years. I fought inside the industry to try to keep that from happening, and then finally realized that I couldn't change it from the inside, and am now trying to fight it from the outside, but I haven't changed.
Okay, so I gotta spend a minute on that. Our theory is that money in politics is what corrupts everything, right? And that because some polls have it at 97%, the lowest I've ever seen it is like 88% of Americans in favor of federal background checks. So, and including a majority of gun owners, including a majority of Republicans, including a majority of NRA members, et cetera, but yet we don't pass it. And my theory is that's because Republican politicians are being paid by the NRA and which is just a front group for gun manufacturers to drive up this radical agenda so that they'll sell more guns. Since you kind of worked on both sides of this, what's your take on that theory?
Okay, so I'm going to poke some holes in your theory.
Go.
I think money helps construct this reality that we live in, but money is not the driving force behind it. It's very much like GOP Republican politics now. What the Republican or what the NRA did and what the firearms industry did is create a radicalized base that now controls everything, very much like the MAGA base controls the Republican Party, right? It's no longer really about money. It's about a radicalized base of voters that will vote in block for one particular candidate. Well, the NRA perfected that prior to the GOP and the Republican Party doing that. So now the real power is from that radicalized single issue voter base that sways important Senate races and House races, congressional, whatever kind of political race by a half point or a point, which is oftentimes what the margin is in these very tight races.
Yeah, so let me ask you a question about the NRA. Do they get a lot of their funding from weapons manufacturers?
There is a flow of funding from firearms manufacturers, but again, most of the monetary juice of the NRA has always come from the base and from large donors. It's not that the firearms manufacturers don't play a role, but they're not the leading role. And I kind of, again, I'm not trying to pick on you, but it's not really that the NRA is a tool of the firearms manufacturers. I found it to be exactly the opposite. I found that the NRA and the radicalized base led the firearms manufacturers, not the other way around. And it ended up being a symbiotic relationship. But if there was an entity bossing anybody around, it was the NRA and the base bossing the manufacturers around.
Yeah, so look, I don't want to have to spend the whole time on that, and I value your thoughts on it, that's why I asked. So the last thing I'll say on it is, my sense of it is that it's a vicious cycle and that the culture comes from somewhere, right? So do I agree with you that there's a culture there? For sure, but it's the invisible hand of the market that usually creates the culture in all of the different markets.
Yeah, you're right. It became a symbiotic relationship where it was good for the NRA to radicalize a base, and then that radicalized base was good for business. And then you had sort of a storm that fed itself, right? It just kept spinning, yeah.
100%, and every time a bad guy with a gun did a massacre, they would come out and say, you need more guns, you need good guys with guns. And then, oh golly gee, we pass no laws to regulate guns? I guess bad guys have more guns. Oh, I guess good guys are gonna need more guns. And then on it goes. Everybody gets rich and everybody dies.
There you have the formula. You pretty much enumerated it, yeah.
Yep, all right, so now they're about to make it worse, or they did. So tell us about the Supreme Court decision, New York State Rifle and Pistol Association, Inc. versus Bruin.
Yeah, so I'll back up just a bit. 1934, We had people have heard of the Al Capone, the Chicago murders, all of the bad stuff that went on with organized crime in the late 30s. From that arose a law called the National Firearms Act, and that law did some basic things. It outlawed fully auto machine guns, or heavily regulated them, things like sawed-off shotguns. It instituted serial numbers on federal mandate for serial numbers from manufacturers. So it instituted lots of federal laws. In 1939, 5 years after that, that law was challenged and it was upheld by the Supreme Court in a case called Miller. Miller established this long-held balance of the way gun cases would be established for the next 80 years. And essentially it said, we will balance public safety with a Second Amendment right. There's a balance there. That balance held all the way up until Heller in 2008, and then the recent case Bruin that you just asked about. Bruin, which was decided in June of this year, completely 100% trashed that balance. It really shredded the precedent in the same way that the Dobbs decision on abortion did a day later. What Bruin did, and Clarence Thomas wrote the opinion, it says, from henceforth, the only way we're going to decide constitutionality on gun laws is if, with a historical standard, if a gun law existed in 1791, the year the Second Amendment was ratified, or 1868, the year the 14th Amendment was ratified, then that gun law is likely to be constitutional. If we didn't have a gun law like that in one of those years, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, 200 years ago, then it's not going to be constitutional. Well, guess what didn't happen 200 years ago? Serial numbers on guns, domestic abusers being denied their rights because domestic abuse wasn't even against the law in 1791. It wasn't even understood to be anything that could be even close to illegal. All sorts of background checks. We didn't have a criminal background check system. We didn't have a computerized background check system. Like, I could go on and on and on with all of the things that Bruin case now endangers.
So, Ryan, it's impossible not to ask, are people really this stupid? So whether it's Clarence Thomas or the other conservative justices that voted it the same way, I mean, really, they're gonna say, oh, because there's no computerized database back in 1791, ha ha ha, you can't track guns. I mean, that's patently absurd. They don't see that that's patently absurd?
So it is patently absurd, and I don't know. There are days when I think, oh my gosh, these people are just like Elon Musk. They got a hold of something, they have no freaking idea what they're doing. That's what I wanna hope. And I hope that the Supreme Court, because all these cases now are racing their way up through. There's a Texas case that's already been adjudicated, right? Where the judge said, nope, domestic abusers, we have to allow them to buy guns because there was no law like that. Like, it's already happening. There's a West Virginia case that outlawed serial numbers on guns. These things are already racing their way up through the lower courts. So we're going to soon find out whether they were that stupid or whether they were meaning to do what they did, because as those cases are gonna make it to the Supreme Court. We're not gonna wait 80 years for another Supreme Court case to reach the Supreme Court, right? And so the rubber's gonna meet the road. We're gonna figure out, did they mean it? Were they serious? Were they thoughtful? Was this strategic, or did they screw up? If they roll it back, which I hope they do, and which all reasonable citizens should, then I think we can say, okay, they didn't know what the hell they did, or Clarence Thomas hoodwinked them, or whatever, but we don't know yet.
So there's another super interesting part of this. This conversation could go for a long time about how the justices are picked to be just that stupid. So when I say that, I want the audience to understand, I don't think they're actually that stupid. I think that they're doing it on purpose because they want to gut every gun law that there is. And if you're saying, hey, it had to exist in 1791 is a great way of making sure no laws pass. Because yes, all this technology didn't exist in 1791. Serial numbers, databases, the number of bullets they could put on a magazine. They couldn't fire 100 bullets at once. So that means they couldn't outlaw firing 30 or 100 bullets at once, right? And so
circular logic,
100%. And they could do that in a lot of different cases, not just about guns. But how do these Supreme Court justices that are so purposely obtuse float to the top rather than the bottom?
Well, two things. First, I think you hit on something, and I think this gun thing is actually at the forefront of the culture war that they're fighting. And they picked this originalist meaning on guns because it's actually interwoven through so many of the other things that the culture war, that we're going to fight the culture war on, and we have been fighting. So you had in Miller, the previous gun case that ruled our lives for 80 years, and our parents and our grandparents, you have this balance of responsibility for society's safety versus individual freedom, right? And it balanced that. Well, what so many on the right want to do is disable that balance. They want to have individual freedoms mean everything, societal needs or collective freedoms mean nothing. Guns is the first place they're doing it, but it's also going to be very prevalent. They picked this reasoning, as they did in Dobbs, because it's going to be very prevalent in environmental cases, in public health cases, all of these things where you have to balance individual freedoms versus collective needs of society. Now, how they rose to the top? Well, the right started signaling 25 years ago that this was very important, right? That extremism in guns was very important. And so justices who were making their way up through the system started issuing decisions in cases 10, 15, 20 years ago to say, hey, look at me, I'm gonna be really extreme on guns. A really good example, 2008, Brett Kavanaugh issued a dissent, a very notable dissent in a case when he was set on the circuit court in DC that espoused this originalist reasoning, the same thing that Thomas used in this case. He espoused it and said it didn't decide the case, but his dissent was out there, and it said we shouldn't even use balance for anything. We should decide all gun cases based on this originalist 1791 thing. So when it came time to pick a very conservative judge, the Federalist Society, President Trump was there. The Federalist Society says, hey, pick this guy. He issued this dissent. He sent this signal up saying he was going to be real extreme. Let's pick him. Same with the other two justices that Trump appointed.
So Ryan, last thing is to come full circle here. I have a theory on that too. The Federalist Society, there's a group of people who half of whom pretend to care about policy issues, et cetera, and philosophies and judicial principles. And the other half know that it's a joke, but they participate anyway. And it's also gets funding from corporate interests, and freedom and individualism just means deregulation of giant corporations. And that Kavanaugh and Gorsuch were largely picked because they both ruled in cases where they allowed corporations to kill their own employees. One was a truck driver case, the other was a SeaWorld case.
I think you're exactly right. And there's no place to signal that better and more accepting to the right than a gun case where you have this defined freedom in the Constitution, so they can stand up and say, hey, look, I'm going to use this originalist meaning. And everybody in the legal community knows, wait, if we apply this originalist meaning, you know what else there wasn't in 1791? Rules against corporations dumping sludge in rivers. You know what I mean? Like it extends throughout the system.
100%. And that's exactly what they're going here. Corporate rule disguised as freedom. And so watch out. That's coming towards gun issues that literally kills people in our communities on a daily basis, let alone everything else. All right, Ryan Busse, author of Gunfight. Really appreciate the conversation and your expertise on this.
Hey, thanks for having me. Appreciate you being interested.
No problem.